Have you asked yourself, why were you called? Let's talk about this. At Taboo Fan, peace and blessings. This is Derric Rau Khu. And in this video, we want to talk about how to recognize, or not really how to recognize, but why were you called? Part of the reason why I'm doing this is by request, is because mainly there's a few family members who've been, they've been called, and they've been trying to, people have been emailing me and they've been saying, what's the reason why I'm on this path? Why was I attracted to this path? Why, all the other paths, they always seem to be closed, but I had to go ahead and I had to learn about this. So I wanted to go ahead and wanted to discuss that real quick, so that we kind of get some clarity on some things. Okay. Now, first of all, in order to go ahead and kind of, get into this, I want to share a little bit about myself, and share a little bit about our way of being. Now, I know the first time people go ahead and they hear about shamanism, we think this whole neo-shamanism thing, and we think that, we're supposed to go ahead and, get a drum and, wear feathers in our head and all that kind of stuff. And that's a shamanistic culture for certain cultures, not necessarily for our culture, okay? Shamanism within our community has been suppressed. It's been suppressed all over, but it's been suppressed within our community as well, okay? And the thing that people don't recognize is that, and when I'm saying a shamanistic culture, I'm saying our ancestral way. So let's get that clear first, okay? We're not talking about going ahead, putting on this whole, putting on a whole attire and all that kind of stuff, and going to go dance and all that kind of stuff, going to an ecstatic dance and everything in order for us to go ahead and call down spirits. Like we see people doing this, and like I said, in the neo-shamanism tradition or neo-shamanistic, this way of life or culture that is going on now. In our community, we're talking about the ancestral way, okay? And what I mean by that, let's go ahead and, like I said, let's get into it. What do I mean by that? When I went ahead and I was, growing up, there were certain signs that occurred in my life. And because my parents were not in a traditional shamanic way of thinking, they weren't in a traditional shamanic culture, a lot of those signs, basically, they were ignored. Okay, so one of the signs, I had this real deep longing to want to be out in nature or be in things, be involved in natural things that was, for the most part, considered unnatural. Okay, now what do I mean by that? For instance, I used to go ahead. We used to have a garage where we used to live, where my parents used to live. And you know how you throw the garage door up? When I was a kid, we would throw the garage door up. I would go up under, or climb up on the garage, and stay up in that, kind of like in the rafters of the garage. Okay, we'll fall asleep there. Would write, would draw, the whole deal. Okay, I mean, there was times in which I fell asleep, and here it is, my parents and everybody there calling. They're like, where's Derric? Where's he at? And I'm up here in the rafters. Okay, I just fell asleep there. Now, I didn't recognize that, and because my parents didn't recognize it, they didn't understand that that's that whole calling, that shamanic part of the calling of wanting to be alone, wanting to go ahead and be, take a break from, take a break from society, to be withdrawn. If we were raised in a traditional society or so, and we had a cave, that's where I would be at, okay? And anybody who recognizes, anybody who's done any kind of research, and if you've done any kind of research on anything regarding the shamanism, anything regarding, spirituality, leaders, spiritual leaders and all that, you'll find out that they always were withdrawn. They had a period in which they would withdraw themselves from everyone else. I think was it Bodavista, who went ahead and went into a cave, and meditated all this time in order for him to go ahead and come up with certain, principles that they followed in and they follow now in Buddhism. Okay, that's one of the signs that you've been called as a child. Another sign that you've been called as a child is that a lot of times when you're a child, you seem to have a lot of wisdom about yourself. Even though you haven't learned this or no one's told you this, it's just that as a child, you just seem to have a lot of wisdom. This is what the elders used to say, or this is the reason why the elders would say, oh, well, this child is they're old soul. Meaning there's certain things that you've come back with from a past or from your previous life that you've brought with you. Okay? And that right there is a sign you've been called. Another sign that you've been called, and like I said, I'm going back and I'm using the childhood because it's a little bit more unadulterated, and I'm trying to get you to make sure that you reflect back on your childhood and see if these things, if they resonated with you. Another sign that you've been called as is that as a child, you displayed usually two out of the four of the psychic senses. Okay, remember the psychic senses are clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyant, and claircognizant. Okay, if you've experienced at least two of those, most likely you were probably called at an early age. You were called to this path. Another sign that you were called is as a child, you're very empathetic. Okay, you're very empathetic to the needs of others. And when I'm saying the needs of others, I'm not just speaking of, people. I'm talking about you're empathetic of animals. You're, empathetic of the plants. You're empathetic of things, insects. I mean, you just seem to have that connection. And it's not really, it's not weird or anything. It's just that you just seem that. But to other people, that's what they looked at it. They looked at it like, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that kid? But this is a sign that you were called. Most likely you were called at an early age. Okay. Now, if you were called at an early age and you were like me, your parents didn't recognize because they weren't brought up in they're not familiar with a shamanic tradition, or they weren't familiar with our ancestral ways. So if you were called and your parents or your guardians, they didn't recognize it, then what happened is those signs basically were ignored. Okay? As I've mentioned before, I am the son of an apostolic Pentecostal preacher. Okay, my parents were heavily in the church. We went to church 7 days out of the week, 5 days out of the week. That's how many times we went to church. Okay, typically, all right. And because my parents were not familiar with that ancestral way, they weren't familiar with the shamanic way of doing things. they thought, just like a lot of people within our community, that, oh, well, just you've been called to be in the church. You've been called to, let's go, it's a little bit deeper than that. Not called to be in the church. You've been called to be a preacher. All right. You've been called to be a pastor. You've been called to be all these other things. All right. And because of that, that's why they try to go ahead and get you to get into the church so much. I have an uncle, which is so funny, and this is why, as I'm thinking of this is the individual that comes to mind. I have an uncle, and my uncle, he was been called. Okay, he's been called to be a pastor, and for 15 years. I think it's longer than that. I'm just being generous. But for 15 years, his church went from being held out of his home to a civic building, to a old gymnasium, to a abandoned, building. I mean, it was abandoned and then they cleaned it up type of deal. The only people who actually went to his church was him, his family, and I think a few cousins. Okay, a few cousins and nieces or so. They were the only people that went to his church for 15 years. Okay, and that's because he's been called, but no one told him, this might not be your calling. Okay, this might not be your calling to be a pastor. Maybe you're called to do something within the church, but you're not called to be a pastor or so. You're not called to be a preacher. All right. Now, not knocking it or anything, but what I'm trying to get us to see is that we've all been called. It's just that we have been called to be specific roles. But because our shamanic culture has been suppressed in our community, we recognize this. Our people recognize this, or they try to, ignore all this, and they say, well, it's all relating to the church. And I'm trying to get us to see that, no, it's all related to our ancestral way. Okay? So, recognize those. Go back and look at those. These are the reasons why we've been called. These are all the reasons why, or these are the reasons, or I would say, this is why we were called when we were a child. All right? So we kind of get us on this path. All right? So, if you've been called and you recognize that out of those 4 or 5 list of things in which I've listed, that you've been called, but you're not involved in a shamanic tradition, or you're getting involved in a shamanic tradition, again, understand, our shamanic tradition is our ancestral way. Okay? That's what the shamanic tradition is within our community. And this is what the calling refers back to. Now, the reason why you're being called, or one of the main reasons why you're being called, okay, you got to kind of go do a little bit of homework on the other part. But the main reasons why you're being called is one or two reasons. Either it's because your ancestors, they're talking a whole lot, your ancestors and your spirits, they're doing a whole lot of talking, or they're not talking at all. All right? If they're doing a whole lot of talking, you're on this path so that you can kind of tune in, you can kind of quiet them a little bit, and you can hone in on your abilities, all right? So that you can be a service to our community, all right? Okay, hope that makes sense. If they're not talking at all, this is because you've come back you've returned back here in this time period because your family line in the community that you're supposed to be serving is in need, and you recognize that there's a need. But in order for you to service your community, you got to open up the doorways, you got to open up some windows, you got to open up some pathways, because you're not hearing them. There's a whole lot of blockages going around, and you're not able to hear them. So you're on this path to open up the pathways so that you can hear them in order for you to service your community. Okay? All right. So recognize there's two reasons why this is happening. And you have to go ahead and you have to identify which one works for you. Now, some of you have called, or some of you have written, and you're asking, but I don't do things this way, or this is not what I've read, or what is the other? Somebody had mentioned, well, they don't do it this way. Okay. And the thing you have to understand about this shamanic path is that shamanism is like spiritual, is like a spiritual scientist. You are doing things that no one else has done before. Yeah, there might be some similarities between what you do and what some other person who's on this path, what they do and what they've done, and which will link you to the past, or link you to and when I'm saying the past, I mean, I'm talking about, 100 years, 300 years, thousands of years ago. Okay. It links you to that. But for the most part, this is a new thing. Okay. And this is what you're supposed to be developing. This is your path. This is the reason why, as I've mentioned before, and I keep saying, you got to do your own homework. And eventually when you've done your homework and you know what you know, you don't care what other people are thinking. You don't care what other people say. All right? Presently, we're still in that stage of caring what other people tell us and caring about other people's opinions. All right? About what we're supposed to be doing. I told you before, fam, it's like this station, this channel was created. This is my part of my therapy in regards to doing my spiritual work. Because for the longest, me having the background I come from and wanting to know the facts, wanting to know, be able to cross the T's and dot the I's, and being very, very detailed oriented, because of me wanting to follow this path, or me on this, just going ahead and doing this channel, for instance, is it's out of my character, quote unquote character. All right. And this is my therapy. This is my therapy to go ahead and to keep doing my spiritual thing. All right. So it's the same way that you have to do. There are certain things in which you've been called to do. And the only way to recognize that is by recognizing why you're on the path. Recognize, first of all. So let's go back. You got to recognize why you've been called, or recognize that you've been called at an early age. Understand what the ancestral way is, or the shamanic path is. And then recognize, are you being called for, are you being called, or are you on the path because they're talking a whole lot and you got to tune in, or because they're not talking at all, so you got to go ahead and you got to open some things up. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. hopefully I'm not speaking too, abstract for you. If you got any questions, if you got any questions or suggestions, like I said, feel free to go ahead and drop me a line. Until next time, talk to y'all later. Hatchapoo. Peace.